Hello, and welcome to my podcast, Good Grief. My name is Dr. Christine Malone, and in this podcast, we talk about trauma, tragedy, and survival. In each episode, I will interview someone that has gone through grief in some way, and we will discuss the impact it has had on their life. By sharing these stories, we hope that others won't feel alone should they be going through similar situations. Enjoy. Okay, listeners, thank you so much for joining me for today's episode. My guest today is Denver-based psychologist and therapist, Dr. Natasha Trujillo, and she's going to talk to us about grieving and her book, which is titled And She Was Never the Same Again. So, Dr. Trujillo, if you would like to go ahead and introduce yourself and kind of tell the guests, or I'm sorry, the listeners, what it is that you do, and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you said, I am a psychologist. I'm actually a counseling and sports psychologist, which is super fun. So what that means is that I was trained as a general psychologist, so all things mental health, but I primarily specialize in working with athletes, usually college, pro Olympic, Paralympic, and some adolescent athletes here and there, or people connected to the athletics community. So sometimes coaches, spouses of athletes, partners of athletes, etc. And I love what I do. I specialize in a few different things, grief and loss being the primary clinical area, but I also do a lot with eating disorders, trauma, anxiety and depressive disorders, perfectionism, and then all things of performance psychology too, of course.
Wow, that is quite a field. I'm listening to that and thinking, oh, I want to talk about that, but we don't have 3 hours to talk. So, so tell us about kind of, I know the book, And She Never Was the Same Again, obviously is going to deal about grief, but kind of focusing on some of the grief, your background in that, and what kind of stuff do you really, bring to the table when you're talking to someone about grieving?
Yeah, I think part of it is expanding the definition of it. It's been so fascinating through this process of writing the book. Actually just this weekend, I have the book launch party coming up this coming weekend. And so this weekend I went out and was shopping for an outfit, and, people at the stores were like, what are you doing? And so I would share a little bit about my book, and they immediately jumped to, oh, well, this person in my life died, or this person in my life died. And I said, yes, of course the book covers death, loss, but it's actually way more nuanced than that, right? We grieve all sorts of things. It's not just about death, loss. And it's just fascinating to hear people kind of be like, oh, yeah, I guess I hadn't thought about that. Or, yeah, I've never looked at it that way. And so that was a big part of why I wrote the book, and a big part of what I bring to the work that I do with people. It's obvious that you're grieving with a death loss, but maybe not as much with other types. So just trying to bring some awareness and education to that, and help give people language and terms and ways to really process through what they're dealing with.
And I know when I was publishing my book, one of the editors was a very young man, and I was telling him what the book was about, and he said, "Oh, I don't know much about that. My parents are still alive, and so on." I said, "So you haven't had an episode, in your life where you've lost something that you really cared about?" And he said, "Well, actually, I had a relationship that ended, last summer, and I'm still not feeling well enough to date anymore." And I said, "Well, you're grieving the loss of you may
Right,
only be 23,
exactly.
whatever, but there." And he was just kind of like, "Whoa," it didn't occur to him. So I think sometimes people don't even realize what you're going through is grief. And that's kind of they want to push it off. Well, it was just a breakup, or it was just this, it was just that. It's like, well, but if it's affecting you, it's impacting you, then that's what we need to talk about.
Yep, absolutely. Well, I try to set it up so each chapter in the book is focused on a different type of loss.
Right.
And kind of goes through, what grief looks like in that specific case. But I also really try to send the message, not just in the book, but in my practice, when I work with clients, is that every life event, whether it's desirable or undesirable, comes with a certain set of gains and losses. It's a both and, it's not an either or.
Right.
And so I think just helping people, be able to zoom out a little bit and take a step back and see that whole picture, and how there's always this multitude of, wow, there's some really great things here and some really not so great things here, and just helping people balance and kind of sit with and learn to accept both is a really important premise of my work and of the book.
Yeah. And your title, as we were talking about before, sort of recording of, And She Was Never the Same Again, to me speaks to a question that I get often asked by someone who's going through a grieving event, which is, when am I gonna feel like I did before this happened? So do you kind of, because your title speaks to that to me, so is that kind of, do you cover that? And there's two, is how you're a changed person and all that?
Yes. I try not to come across too quote unquote negative or cynical, right? But when I get that question in my practice, people are like, oh, when am I going to be over this? Or I don't want to feel this way anymore. Or when am I going to go back to normal, quote unquote? And I just answer, right? You're not. You will never be the same again. What you have gone through has been very impactful, and there's gains and losses to that. In some ways, it's great that you're never going to be the same again. In some ways, it's tragic,
Yeah.
but you have to be able to hold both at the same time.
Yeah, no, I'm a big believer in that. And I can think of many times in my life where I've hit that. I'm sitting here and then this thing happens and I go this way. And I sometimes wonder what would have happened if that didn't happen. And I would, where else would I be?
Yes.
And I have no idea, but it comes
Yeah.
to mind.
Yeah.
So
I
I wanna
had the
thank you.
title too. It came to me. So the very last line of the book and the title were two of the things that kind of right at the beginning when I was really getting behind this that just came to me and I kind of knew. And the title was initially it was one of those 4 a.m. things where it just kind of came to me and I was like, that was it. And I was really referring to myself, right? Like I had gone through two very significant losses in a pretty short period of time. And I was thinking about how other people were looking at me and were talking about me. You know, my friends and my family were getting together and they were like, she's not great. Things are not good. And so I was almost thinking through what they were saying to me and they were saying about me, right? And me will never be the same again. So that's how I was like, huh,
Yeah.
yeah, that's it. That's the title. But she, of course, represents much more than just me.
Yeah, no, for sure. No, I think, and it's my experience, I think when people absorb that it is like the first step to becoming into the grieving process is really to understand you're not going to get back to before you lost this thing because you lost it
Yes.
and you're
Yes.
different now and so on
Yeah.
and that's
In some ways that can be really liberating though too, because then people feel like they're doing it
yes,
wrong.
yes,
Why do I still feel this way? Why is this taking forever? I just need to get back to that. And I think when you kind of break that illusion that you're just going to return to your former self, it really can allow them the space to kind of integrate their losses into their life and figure out how to move forward.
right. And it kind of gets them to feel like you don't need to stumble over that. I think it's because mental illness, any kind of mental illness and grieving, that kind of stuff that's not visible to the naked eye, people want to translate that to regular medicine. So I broke my leg. I get rehab, I get the physical therapy, and someday I'm going to be able to ride my bike again. So I think people
Yeah.
try to make it more medical, and it's like it's not really the way that it is. I mean, yeah, it might be you'll never be able to ride that bike again in a really severe case, but for the most part, we'll get back to this, we'll get back to that. So that is the sense that people have is I need to get back to there rather than,
Yes.
oh, I'm not going back there. Maybe I need to learn how to do something over here. So has that kind of been your
Oh, for
experience?
sure. Yes, yes, absolutely. And then you also make me think about pathologizing grief, with what you just said too, and how frequently do we want to say, oh, well, now this person is depressed, or I don't know, someone has trauma, and we want to say they have all these other slew of disorders. And so that's another big thing for me is I don't want to pathologize grief because it's universal, it's natural, it's appropriate often
Yeah.
and it doesn't go away. So to slap a diagnosis or to throw medication or to stigmatize someone for experiencing the beauty and the pain of life at the same time just doesn't feel good to me. And so that's a huge piece of this is just helping people recognize you're not insane. Life
Yeah.
is hard.
Yeah. And to kind of recognize, I know everybody's different, but kind of recognize some of the more common things that people do go through in the grieving process. So I know I'll give myself an example. The one of the first grieving events I had was a fiance that died in a car accident when I was like 21 years old. And I moved from where I was living in New York at the time. I moved back here to Seattle where I'm at now. And I borrowed my mother's car to go to the shopping mall. And my brain was not working. I was foggy and I didn't expect that. I didn't know that was part of this.
Yes.
So I went inside the mall and I came out and I couldn't find my car. And I was sitting on the steps by the mall entrance crying. And then one of the security guards came out and he said, what can I help you with? And I said, I can't find my car. And he said, what kind of car are you driving? And I said, I don't remember. And I remember thinking he's going to call the white coat people or whatever, they're going to come and get me. But I
Yeah.
had a really good therapist who said to me, you will pass through that. You will. And I did, but it was so shocking to me to think my mind is gone. And I'm a person my mind is everywhere. So to not have my mind be there anymore was
Yes.
very scary for me to that. So I think some of the whole process, and maybe you touch on this in your book with the different types of grieving, is to help people understand, what might this person be going through and what might another person do to say or help or whatever it might be. to know, right? Or if I'm reading that book to know, oh gosh, getting all foggy like that for, 6 months or whatever is normal. And it's not, it's not a weird thing. I shouldn't freak out and say, oh my gosh, my brain is never going to come back.
Yes. And I think those nuances are really important. Each individual really will have a unique experience with grief. And even the same person, right? Like how I grieve with regard to my grandma dying is very different than how I grieved when I retired from sport, for example, right? And so I'm the same person, but depending on the circumstances, or even with multiple death losses, right? My aunt versus my uncle versus my grandma, things like that.
Yeah.
Or this breakup versus that breakup. And I think one of the other really challenging pieces is that grief can manifest in so many ways. And I think that can really throw people off too. You're talking about this cognitive fog, but physically, we can feel grief physically and feel like, oh my God, now there's something wrong with me, or, what's going on here with this? Or, yeah. So we talk a lot about somatic stuff. Or this idea of the self, we lose who we are, right? Going back to this idea of, and she was never the same again. It's like, who am I now? Values can be, up in arms, or beliefs can be up in arms. And so all of that stuff is just so important to help recognize it is not just you're sad and you cry all the time. There's so many ways that it can manifest.
There are, and actually I'm gonna make myself a note because there's two different things I wanted to pick up on that. First of all, I think in most people's experiences, people aren't comfortable talking about grieving. It's kind of like anything to do with,
Yes.
as I mentioned, like mental illness, whatever. People don't want to talk about depression and so on. That's that stigma that's attached to it, especially in certain types of grief. So like if I lose my 95-year-old grandfather and I tell my coworkers, they're all going to be, oh, tell me about him and he had a great life and blah, blah, blah.
Right.
I lose my 4-year-old son, people shut down and say, I don't even know what to say to her. So
Yes.
I'm just going to back away slowly because I don't know what to say. And that's part of that the stigma that people who have those
Yeah.
more non-traditional losses, I guess is what I
Yes.
call those, really
Yes.
go through.
Yes. This was actually a variable in my dissertation when I was in grad school, but I looked at this idea of social constraint because I looked at parental absence and I looked at physical absence, but then I also looked a little bit more nuanced into different types of unmet needs, because you can have a parent who's physically present but emotionally absent, for example. So without getting in the weeds too much of the research, this idea of social constraint is that, it might be easier for me to talk about my parent who died from cancer, so they're no longer in my life, versus my parent who is incarcerated for life.
Yeah.
I can't talk as much about that.
Yeah.
Or like you said, right? If it's a death where it's more expected, oh, this person lived such a long life, versus an unexpected, your fiance or your child dying, where then people are like, ooh, I don't know what to say about that. Or in the sports world, right? When you just graduate, it's kind of easier to talk about that loss versus a career-ending injury, or
Right.
getting hurt 2 months before the Olympics because that's coming up, something like that. So those nuances are just so important with this perceived sense of how much we can open up and get support and find connection when we're grieving.
Yes. The other thing I wanted to touch on, I call it pockets of grief, and that's when grief comes back to you, years later. So you've gone through a loss and you've processed it and so on, and then something happens that brings that back up again. And my example for that, my daughter was 2 when her dad died, and she has no actual memories of him. I mean, we've got photos and videos, but no real memories to speak of. And when she graduated high school, she really went through that pocket of grief of my dad's not here. When she got married, that was the big one. When she got married, she had her brother walk her down the aisle, and she saved a seat for her dad at the front row to acknowledge that he was there that day. But those type, and I've had many people say, well, gosh, it's been 30 years. It's like, well, no, sometimes it comes right back to you.
Yes. Yes. And that is a huge part of the book, and something that I do in my clinical work all the time is just help people understand that, again, grief never goes away, but it does morph and change shape. It looks different over time, but
Right.
it's always kind of there. It does become this companion, unwanted or not, but it is there, and it does continue to take up space. And some days that space is a lot more overwhelming than others. others.
Yeah. Yeah. I heard somebody liken it to having the grief is sitting at your table now. So you have to make space for them at your table now because they're always going to be there and you just become comfortable with them and they're part of your family or part of whatever. And that kind of metaphor made me go, oh, that's actually kind of like, it's like I'm a very visual person. I can picture that and go, yeah, I can see that where you want to shove that person, right? Let's get that grief right out the door because I'm done with that. Whereas you really have to, like anything, what that's changes, I have to realize I'm different now and be comfortable with that or learn to live with that. And it's not always bad. It's really not always bad. I mean, speaking for myself, I can tell you the different episodes I've been through, though some of them I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. I'm thankful. I've learned a lot of lessons in my life. And yes, some of them were not lessons I want to go through again, but I've changed because of that. And I like who I am. So I'm good with, how that change happened and so on.
Yeah, it's really strange to wrap your head around the duality of that, right? Because to experience such loss and such pain also means that we experience really profound love and
Right.
attachment and
Yeah.
desire for something.
Yeah.
And so
It's
you can't have one without the other. Sometimes I'll get feedback where it's like, oh man, that's negative. Grief is just always going to be there and it's this companion. And it's like, well, it's not necessarily negative because that love, right? And that profound sense of desire and connection is also there. So
Yep.
again, right? It's like it just how are you pulling them up to the table? What sort of space are you able to share and to shine light on both?
Right, right. And yeah, even a step further to be able to empathize with other people on their own losses and say, I get it. I completely get it. And
Yeah,
I'm not
yeah.
gonna say something stupid, but I'm just, whatever. I can just, whatever, that whole thing,
Yes,
I
yes.
understand, or in my case, I know I've often say this is that there really is no topic that I won't talk about. So if someone wants to tell me, I had a coworker the other day tell me that a good friend of theirs had committed suicide. We're in a work meeting and I said, well, I want to talk to you after the meeting. And I just said, anything you want to talk about, I'm here. I'll be happy to talk to you. It's not going to make me uncomfortable. It's not going to make me shy away and go, oh, that's really a horrible one, but I'm here for you.
Yeah.
Same thing with
Yeah.
drug overdose, something like that, where those, the deaths that aren't accepted, I guess is how I'll phrase that.
Sure. Again, the social constraint of it, right? Oh, this one it's too touchy. Yeah, yeah.
And then it makes the
You
person,
also,
oh, go ahead.
oh, sorry.
Because
I
it
was
makes
just
the
gonna say,
person left behind thinking that they then there's nothing wrong with me because I can't talk about this. There's nothing wrong with me because it's
yes,
shameful and all that. And it's like, no, it's not. So, I mean, it should.
yes, yes. I love what you said too a couple minutes ago about this idea of, well, I wouldn't wish nor want to go through those things again, but I am thankful for them. And that's something that I think is super important. Now, the timing with which that idea gets introduced is really important, right? That, like, for example, the at your son's funeral or the day after your fiance's death, that is not the time to be like, you're going to be thankful for this someday, or you're going to be grateful. But I do think in time, it takes years sometimes to recognize some of the growth or some of the strength or some of the ways in which we become resilient or just move through some of these experiences. But I think timing of introducing that is super important. And I think it is fair to say there are some situations where it's like, yeah, I would prefer not to have that growth and to
Yeah, I'd
have
rather
this back.
not.
Because
Yeah.
it's
I know. I often said that about, especially about my son, that I'm very happy that I was chosen to be his mom. And I'm thinking no one else would want the role really, because it was really a bad time and he was really sick. But yeah, like no, he taught me more lessons than any speaking person I've ever met in my life. And that's just goes to show you that we learn from different things that aren't necessarily a book or, a show we watched or an article we read or whatever, that we learn from other things, and experiences are definitely things that we learn from.
yes, yeah, absolutely.
Well, we are definitely going to put a link to your book in the podcast notes because I myself am looking forward to reading it, and I assume a lot of other people who are listening to this show will too. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we end today?
I would just like to say thank you so much for having me and for bouncing off, some really cool ideas and delving into some of the nuance. It really is cool to have conversations where we're not focused on this sort of how-to strategy or going through the stages of grief or that sort of thing, because it is too complicated to say, here are your steps or here are the stages, because it really does look different for everyone. So it's really just refreshing and awesome to have a conversation where we can dig in a little bit without these expectations or standards
Exactly, right. I'm not saying that here's your checklist, you want to do this, that, and the next thing. It's like, no,
Yes.
here's some things that you may be experiencing is different rather than here, you should get out of the anger phase by then. You should this, or you should get rid of their stuff, or all these things. It's like, no, not necessarily. Whatever. Those types of conversations is like it's not the same. It's not one size fits all. And that's again, I think when people, put it to medicine, it's like not everybody heals in the same way for an injury or whatever it might be as well. It's the same exact thing. So, don't be down on yourself if you get your 3 days of bereavement leave from work, for example.
Right.
You come back and you're supposed to be okay now after 3 days of bereavement.
Yes.
Maybe in some cases, but not in a lot of other cases.
Yeah, yeah. And I would think the last thing that I would leave people with would just be exactly what you and I have spent the last half hour or so doing, which is making these untalkable things more talkable and
Yeah.
shedding light on them and giving them a seat at our table, which I think is really important. And that's one of the main messages I wanted to send in the book, is that sometimes, as difficult and as challenging as it is, you have to talk about it. You have to figure out how to express it,
Yeah.
and let it out and come to terms with it. And of course, use that universal need we all have to belong and to connect with other people to assist us in moving through some of this stuff along the way.
Yeah. Perfect point. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you today. Thank you so much for being my guest.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Good Grief. To hear more about my personal story, please pick up a copy of my book, The Day I Became the Spider Killer, a memoir of trauma, tragedy, and survival, available in paperback, Kindle, and Audible via Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and other online book retailers.